Hello guys, and welcome to Knowledge and Insights. This is a new channel aimed at explaining the world in a realistic and pragmatist way. Today we will be discussing why so many Russians support Putin's invasion of Ukraine. So first of all, do Russians really support Putin? The answer to this is yes, and there are many surveys that support this. In one survey, 65% of respondents approved of Russia's actions in Ukraine. In another figure, it was 71%. This could, however, be because of the state-connected polling agencies exaggerating the numbers of supporters. But that there are indeed many Russians who are pro-invasion is also confirmed by independent polls, such as a poll done by CNN, showing an approval of well above 50%. And you can of course say about CNN what you want, but they certainly do not have any motives to seek out such a result. So now that we have established that there is indeed support for the war in Ukraine, we can now delve deeper into the reasons why. Well, the first is that across the world there are varying perceptions of what freedom really is. For example, in EU countries, freedom is perceived as freedom of speech, while in the US, people see this topic more business-wise, and for Americans, freedom is the freedom to start a business. Well, when it comes to Russians, freedom is much simpler. Freedom is to not be in jail. And this, of course, says a lot about the Russian mindset and about the fact that although the Soviet days are over, many ideas survive to this day. One of these Soviet remains is the state television. This is another huge factor for Putin to gain support. The constant portrayal of one narrative has created a situation in which many Russians do not even know of opposing views, and the ones who know of them are not confronted by them as much or only see the debunking of those opinions. The Russian state media's main narrative is that Russia is protecting Russian speakers in the Donbass from Ukrainian persecution. It is important to, of course, keep in mind that this was indeed true, but not at all on the scale in which Putin portrays it. It was also not an institutional problem, but rather one of racism by diverse extremist groups. These groups for Putin form the representation of the whole of Ukraine, and even Zelensky himself. Among these groups, indeed, Nazis do exist, but Putin uses the same trick for the Nazi issue among extremists and makes it a Ukrainian issue. For Putin, it is very important to keep the Nazi narrative alive. Ukraine is namely a brother nation, and thus many Russians feel compassion towards them. And in order to not upset the Russian population, he needs to keep it a fight against the Nazis and not the Ukrainians, something that is of course not true at all. The same goes for the term invasion. Invading Ukraine would mean that ordinary Ukrainians would be involved, which they of course are, but for the narrative it has to be a special operation. This term makes it seem as if Putin is carefully and precisely attacking the Nazi enemy, and that he is not in war with Ukraine. In his view, even the Ukrainian president with Jewish heritage is a part of this so-called Nazi enemy. Not all Russians have, of course, fallen for this narrative, especially the more international-oriented Russians in the bigger cities. The opposition in these big cities might be bigger than we think. We cannot know for sure, as a lot of people who are against the war remain silent in fear of criminal punishment. This is because publicly contesting the Kremlin's war propaganda comes with prison terms up to 15 years. Not only that, but Russians even appear to be informing on one another in growing numbers, condemning friends, neighbors, and colleagues for insufficient support of the war. This is exactly how things went down in Soviet times, once again showing how the Soviet mindset never truly disappeared. Putin seems to encourage or at least appreciate this behavior, as he publicly praised his fellow Russians' ability to distinguish true patriots from scum and traitors, and simply spit them out like a fly that accidentally flew into their mouths. But why do Russians do this? It is very obvious that the current pressure from the secret services is nothing compared to how the KGB operated and forced people to inform on each other in the past. Well, this can partially be explained by the relatively recent rise of nationalism in Russia. This nationalism for a lot of people implicates that you should always stand behind your country, whether it is right or wrong. Russia is always right by simply being Russia and you being Russian. This justifies basically anything for the biggest Putin supporters. For the other Russians who form a majority, they don't really feel a sense of political responsibility whatsoever. That means that the state can do absolutely anything and people won't think it has anything to do with them. Unlike Western democracies, many Russians do not have a past of engaging in politics. Most people do not really see it as a thing they are part of. There has always been someone who was running the country and led it in the way that he saw fit. And Putin in this regard is just like his predecessors and arguably much more humanitarian when compared to Stalin or Lenin. Then there is also the factor of a large political trend of pessimism in Russia. For a lot of Russians, freedom of expression is considered to be stupid. The idea that as you get older, you start to speak less freely and with more considerations prevails. Freedom of speech in the eyes of a traditional Russian is just a foolish thing that children do and that can only incriminate you if you say the wrong things. Well, now that we know about this deep-rooted political culture in Russia, we can now answer, will the Russian support decrease over time? Well, this is of course very uncertain, but there are reasons for that support this claim and also reasons that deny this claim. Support for the war could indeed diminish as more and more Russian soldiers die and many will lose relatives. It could also be that Putin starts making use of more destructive methods of warfare with terrible footage of Ukrainian victims as a consequence, and that this footage reaches the Russian population. Well, on the other hand, there are also reasons why support is not likely to decrease. This is mainly because many of those who oppose the war have already fled Russia. They have either done this in recent years or since Putin launched the invasion on February 24th. Despite international sanctions and the collapse of the ruble, tens of thousands of Russians have left the country since the beginning of the month, March 2022. There could be a possible future scenario in which many of Putin's critics will be abroad, and that any people starting to see the real face of the war will join them. Now that we have established that it is unlikely that the whole of Russia will subscribe to the Western view of the war, we can now look into why Russians remain supportive of the war. The International Crisis Group said in a 2018 report that ever since the early 2000s, Russia had witnessed a rebirth of patriotic mobilization. This is because of a strong state effort to instill patriotic values, celebrate Russia's military past, and promote Moscow's revival as a global power. These forms of education certainly helped build support among ordinary citizens in supporting Moscow's more assertive foreign policy, including its increasingly bitter standoff with the West and interventions in countries of the former Soviet space. This massive effort included patriotic textbooks and academic programs such as the cult of the Soviet role in World War II, the funding of patriotic films and museum programs, the promotion of nostalgia for the Soviet Union, and of course the rehabilitation of notorious Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin. It is of course easy to think that this is the main reason for Russian support of the invasion of Ukraine, but that is not entirely true. When examining the middle-aged and elderly population in Russia, we can see a clear negative attitude towards the West. This group largely hates homosexuals and liberals and has a fear and sentiment towards the West that already existed before all of the propaganda began. And Putin has definitely used this to his advantage. This is also the reason why a lot of Western conservatives still feel sympathy for the Russian cause and view the war as more of a cultural war, with Putin being on the good side or the traditional side. Okay, now we will get into one of the most important and also most overlooked reasons for Putin's popularity. Because of the rivalry with Russia, it is very often ignored that Putin has also done some very good things for Russia. Ever since he started as a president, the country has seen a huge GDP growth, increased job payments, decreased poverty, and decreased crime. Keeping in mind the position that Russia was in before he started, we can definitely say that under Putin's rule, the living standard of Russians has greatly improved, giving him a strong reputation and a lot of credibility. In addition, Putin has also revived traditional values, not going along with the woke ideology. Even concerning the Russian economy long term, he has done a lot to lower debt and put much better pension policies in place. To the West, Putin seems to have been a terrible thing for Russia, but the following quote is true for a majority of Russians. We have never lived in such peaceful and wealthy times like now. However, we will still have to see how long this remains to be true. If the sanctions on Russia really start to affect the country and if Putin fails to find new trade partners, this idea can of course drastically change. But nonetheless, Putin is simply put less bad than Stalin, which is not an achievement, of course, but for many Russians this was a reality. So what we see as preposterous is perceived as very mild by a lot of Russians. This also strongly correlates with the fact that Russians traditionally appreciate a very strong leader. Russia's new wealth, bad memories of previous revolutions, and Putin's very effective use of police control will certainly make sure that the president will keep his place in the Kremlin in the near future. When comparing Russia now with the Russia from the 90s, it's almost a totally different country. In the 90s, the country was the perfect portrait of a failed state. Corruption, no money, no functional markets, mafia, prostitution, violence, and oligarchs taking all the money, with the common people being left on their own. Whatever happens to Russia due to the war in Ukraine, it can never be worse than that. At this moment, the streets have order. There is no rampant violence, and Russia is arguably still doing well despite all of these sanctions. In Russia's view, before Putin, there was the so-called American compliant puppet, Yeltsin, a man who allowed for mass starvation and poverty, salaries not being paid for years, and senior citizens on the streets with a massive crime rate. The country was basically on the brink of dissolution. This is why Russians support Putin, and they believe that the American hegemony hates to see Russia successful, hates to see Russia being powerful. For this reason, the Americans seek to pollute the proud Russian culture with its rainbow Western ideas, such as promoting transgenderism, seeking to convert their children from young ages, destroying Christianity, mass immigration, and the loss of traditional values. Putin is their champion in this fight to save Russia. The narrative of Russia being threatened is smartly being used by Putin when he shows maps of NATO expansion. On these maps, the Russian population can literally see the Western rainbow atheists close in by swallowing former USSR countries. This narrative of being surrounded does great work for Putin's propaganda machine. Then we move on to the last point of today, which is another concern of Russians, namely, what's gonna happen if Putin is gone? At least he has already stolen a lot and satisfied his appetite. A new president and his team would certainly organize a new oligarchy and start stealing like crazy again. A lot of Russians think to be better off with good old Vlad. They find it hypocritical that the USA was allowed to engage in wars like Iraq, Vietnam, Libya, etc., but that Russia gets this backlash. They just see it as the way strong leaders engage in politics. Russians do love to play safe, considering their past, and it's definitely not far-fetched to rationalize that they do indeed live in safer times under Putin's regime. So this was basically my summary on why Russians support the war in Ukraine. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe to Knowledge and Insights if you found this interesting. See you next time.